you had the attention of all Black Africans listening across the continent today, what would be that one most significant thing you would want them to understand about Afrikaners?
People often say the Afrikaners are the white tribe of Africa. And I think it's true in the sense that if we go to the Netherlands, we are not Dutch. If we go to France, we are not French. If we go to Germany, we are not Germans. If we go to America, we are not Americans. So I have spent a lot of time reading Afrikaner philosophy. The most important theme that comes out throughout all the major works that have to do with Afrikaner philosophy is this idea of becoming a nation on the African continent while having ancestors in Europe, but regarding yourself as African and not as European.
Do you consider yourself African? If so, how?
The Afrikaners have no other home than Africa, and South Africa in particular. And I've been to Europe, and I don't regard it as my home. It's a great place to visit, but I don't feel like I'm at home. I feel at home under the African sun and with the African soil below my feet. We regard ourselves as African, and what we mean by that is not so much that we are civilizationally African, but that we belong in Africa. Our identity was forged in Africa. We've been on the African continent for almost 400 years. We became a unique people in Africa. We developed our own language on the African continent, and we named it after the African continent. It's called Afrikaans.
I want to know, how do you explain your African identity to other whites when you speak, especially outside of Africa? Is there a kind of contradiction you feel sometimes? Does it sometimes feel awkward speaking to another white, say a Swede or a Finn or a Dutch, but then you still maintain a form of Africanness? This is a little bit philosophical, but I know you're so philosophical in that sense. Does it feel like a contradiction somehow sometimes?
I don't necessarily think that includes the Afrikaners. I think we descend from Western civilization, but we are African. If by African you mean that this is our home, this is our place. The fact is if the Afrikaner people are not indigenous to Africa, the question then is, to which continent are we indigenous? Because we're not indigenous to Europe. You say to someone that you cannot be of Western descent, you cannot be Western and African, is like saying you cannot be green, you have to be blue or yellow, you can't be both. I was young when we moved to Tzaneen, which is an agricultural community in the north of South Africa, not far from Zimbabwe. And I was born in the last years of the apartheid system. When I was in primary school from 1992, initially it was only white people in the school. It was an Afrikaans school. And I remember around 1995 or 6, some black children started enrolling in our school. And it was different for us. It was a unique experience. We weren't used to having black kids in our school. But I honestly can't remember any racism. I can't remember children being angry about the black kids, but more curious than angry. I've spent some time reading the works of some African philosophers, people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. What strikes me about that, reading African, you could say black African philosophy, is, in a sense, it's not too different from Afrikaner philosophy, that there's this trying to come to terms with a complicated past. We had this very unfortunate history with the British, who really denigrated us during the Anglo-Boer War. They had this big propaganda campaign about how the Afrikaners are lesser human beings, and we are these dirty people just living in the bush. And so we've had some experience with that, and the way through was to take pride in who we are.
What does land mean to you personally? What would you say land means to an Afrikaner? How would you say the quest to return the land, especially as I hear from the EFF and the MK parties, how is it articulated or understood by Afrikaners or white South Africans today?
So there is a reason why the Afrikaners are also known as the Boers, because the word Boer means farmer. And we became a nation through farming, and that's actually how our story starts. In back in the Cape, when the Dutch had this.
The Afrikaner refugee program in the wake of the Trump-Musk fallout. Do you think that program is doomed? Is that fallout? Do you think that fallout could affect that program?
To be completely honest with you, I'm deeply saddened by the whole refugee program. What I'm concerned about is what could happen if Donald Trump is not president anymore.
Okay, guys, thanks so much for joining Kwazemi once more. Like you know, my channel, Kwazemi, I try to study South Africa from an outsider's perspective, trying to help you see South Africa through the lens of an outsider. And I'm originally Nigerian, as you know, really into African history. I had my PhD in African history, focusing on Ghana, and started this channel because I realized that many West Africans do not know South Africa. And I think I would argue many Africans do not know South Africa. And so to join me in trying to really get that knowledge up, I have been fortunate enough to find a mind. I would argue that he's a mind when you really want to understand South Africa. You know, Dr. Ernst. I've been criticized on my channel once for not pronouncing your name correctly. But I hope I do justice with Dr. Ernst Roets.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on your channel.
Yeah.
But I really don't mind. My name is a bit difficult to pronounce to anyone that doesn't speak Afrikaans. Even my friends in Europe and America, they have difficulty pronouncing it.
Wow.
But you did very well. So, and thank you for having me. I mean, I've been following your channel, and I'm very happy to be a guest.
Wow, that's good. That's good. I mean, like I'm working on my Swedish, and I come to realize that Swedish is close to Afrikaans. I've been hearing some words that seem to be similar. So maybe one day we might be having a discussion in Afrikaans. You never know.
Maybe, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to run through a few questions just to really get to know. I really want I want this blog, this podcast to speak to many people like me who, first of all, who have been born in Africa, for me personally, Lagos, Nigeria, you know, grow up listening and trying to understand South Africa from from the lens of an African young person, and not getting so familiar with what many would call the white South Africans. But as I've grown older, I've come to have a lot of friends who would argue or maybe identify as white South Africans, so in that regard. And so this interview is trying to really get to the African part of you, as weird as that might sound, but I really know and I believe that, you know, there have been many things you have picked up from the soil. I mean, like, I usually like to state this statement by Kwame Nkrumah, who said that he's not African because he was born in Africa, but he's African because Africa was born in him. All right, so
Yeah,
that's something I
that's
usually
beautiful.
Yes, that's something I usually see and remember, try to recall when I see many white Indian coloreds, you know, in South Africa. But first things first, Dr. Ernst. Africans are really undergoing a deep awakening in their historical consciousness today. They are more aware of their history than I think any moment in history on the continent. This awareness actually stems from a bitter past, a bitter history of slavery, colonialism, imperialism. If you go to Burkina Faso or the Sahel today, it's called French neocolonialism, and all of that. But if you had the attention of all Black Africans listening across the continent today, what would be that one most significant thing you would want them to understand about Afrikaners in Africa's history today and in the present in Africa?
Well, thank you. That's a big question, and I'm very happy to talk about that. So, the question is, if I could only say one thing that was probably the most important thing, or convey this to Africans, people living on the African continent in general, about the Afrikaners, not just people in South Africa, that would be that to really understand the Afrikaner people, you have to understand this balance that between the West and Africa that we see within our identity. So I have spent a lot of time reading Afrikaner philosophy. And especially during the last 100 years or so, there were really some incredible philosophers who spoke Afrikaans, who came from the Afrikaner community. And I've asked myself the question, if you had to explain Afrikaner philosophy to someone that knows nothing about the Afrikaners, what would the most important tenets of that be? And I think the most important theme that comes out throughout all the major works that have to do with Afrikaner philosophy is this idea of becoming a nation on the African continent while having ancestors in Europe, but regarding yourself as African and not as European. Now, but what's important to understand here is the word African and the word Western carries a double meaning, and therefore it could lead to some confusion. So Afrikaners, in many ways, you could say culturally speaking, we are Westerners. But when we say that, we don't mean that Europe is our home. I mean, I've been to Europe and I don't regard it as my home. It's a great place to visit, but I don't feel like I'm at home. I feel at home under the African sun and with the African soil below my feet.
Wow,
But our culture was in large parts developed as part of the Western civilization, you could say. But at the same time, we regard ourselves as African. And what we mean by that is not so much that we are civilizationally African, but that we belong in Africa. Our identity was forged in Africa. We've been on the African continent for almost 400 years. We became a unique people in Africa. The Afrikaners have no other home than Africa, and South Africa in particular. We developed our own language on the African continent, and we named it after the African continent. It's called Afrikaans. We have developed our own unique culture, our own unique ways of eating, our own unique music, our own unique ways of socializing, of engaging, our own traditions from a micro level, such as things that you do during weddings and things that you do with your friends, to a more macro level, like the way we think about God, the way we think about our place on earth and so forth. All of these things, while it has been greatly shaped by our Western tradition, and while it has been greatly shaped by our experience on the African continent, it was developed on the African continent, and we have no other home. So people often say the Afrikaners are the white tribe of Africa. And I think it's true in the sense that if we go to the Netherlands, we are not Dutch. If we go to France, we are not French. If we go to Germany, we are not Germans. If we go to America, we are not Americans. You can become those things if you assimilate. But many of us, and I would say most of us, don't actually want to assimilate because we really love our culture and we really love our history, and we want these things to be preserved.
Wow, that's such an education. Thanks so much. I mean, like, that's really powerful. And many times it takes me back because I also spent some years in Finland where I studied for my master's and PhD in all of that. And I actually came to also see some second generation Africans anyway, who would also consider themselves Afro-Finns, something like that. But they have not been able to kind of like live as long as Afrikaners have lived in Africa to develop all these things you speak about, the culture, the music, and all of that. But that's a really interesting one. So for my next question to you would be a really strange question anyway, but I just really want to hear from you. Like, do you consider yourself African? If so, how? I want to get into the Africanness of your person. If you are able to share a little bit of your family history with me, your childhood, if you don't mind, relationship with your friends. I'm interested to know if you had Black friends growing up in your school, in your neighborhood. Were there Blacks in your school? What kind of foods? You've spoken a lot about your food anyway, but what kind of foods did you eat? And where some of these foods you've come to eaten by some of the what you would call Black South Africans or coloreds or Indians today. Are just really some significant stories from your child growing up in South Africa to a young kid in Lagos who is really hungry to understand what life could mean or feel like for a white South African in Africa?
So, thank you. I was born in Pretoria, which is where I live now and where I'm speaking to you from now, but I didn't grow up in Pretoria. I was young when we moved to Tzaneen, which is an agricultural community in the north of South Africa, not far from Zimbabwe. And I was born in the last years of the apartheid system. And apartheid actually ended in 1990, not in 1994, as many people believed, because in 1990, when I was 4 years old, the apartheid legislation were repealed, which is why Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and many ANC members in exile went back to South Africa. And that's when they started negotiating for a new South Africa, as they called it, which led to the election in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became the president. Now, I mentioned that because I was 4 years old when apartheid ended. And so I don't really have political memories from the apartheid system. What I can tell you is my father worked for the military. Back then, especially during the 70s and the 80s, we had the border war, the war in Angola, and there was conscription. So the Afrikaners, after finishing high school, they had to go join the military. And so my father did as well. And he left the army at around 1990, I think, which is when we moved up to Tzaneen. Now I love Tzaneen, and I have all the best memories thinking back about my childhood. It's an agricultural community. Demographically, there are very few white people compared to black communities living in the area, the Sutus or the Sepedis. So I grew up. The reason I mention this also is when I was in primary school from 1992. Initially, it was only white people in the school. It was an Afrikaans school, and I remember around 1995 or six. Some black children started enrolling in our school, and it was different for us. It was a unique experience. We weren't used to having black kids in our school, but I honestly can't remember any racism. I can't remember children being angry about the black kids, but more curious than angry. And I remember there was a girl, if her name was Melba, she was in my class. It was the first time I was in primary school. I think I was maybe 11 years old when she was in my class, even though it was an Afrikaans school. Then I went to high school. I went to a school called High School Merensky, which is a very good school. It still is. It's a parallel medium. In other words, it has Afrikaans and English classes, and it was significantly more black than my primary school, which was only Afrikaans. So it was, I guess, 40% black, 60% white. The Afrikaans classes in which I was mostly white, but we engaged with white and black kids, played on the school ground and so forth. Oftentimes people would have friends within their, you could say, cultural groups or racial groups. So the Afrikaans kids tend to have predominantly Afrikaans friends and so forth. And I think that's normal. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I wouldn't say this, but given that you ask, I actually had quite a few black friends in school. And I remember spending some time, sometimes during breaks, we called it pausa, when there was, a break in high school and the kids would play outside. I would have some black friends and I would engage with them and speak with them. And what's also funny, a funny story about growing up in that town is in high school, I started doing skateboarding. And I was very fanatic about it. I spent hours every day. I spent hours practicing skateboarding tricks and so forth. And the best places to do skateboarding were you could say Tzaneen was a town, but in sort of the town center. And I didn't always tell my parents that I went there because they were concerned about crime and I wasn't concerned about crime. And so me and my friends, I would tell them I would go to visit my friends, and then we would actually go to the taxi rank where the taxis go and pick up people, which of course is like the black area of the town. And we would do skateboarding there, and I eventually got to know I say all in quotation marks, like virtually all the black homeless kids of Tzaneen. Wow. I got to know them by name. And I remember the one was named Raider, the one was named Lucky. They all had these gangster nicknames. and we really became friends. So when we went skateboarding, we would take we would take snacks with us, whether that would be potato chips or cold drinks or Coca-Colas, and then eventually we knew the homeless kids would be there, and we would want to give them something. So we started taking extras, and then they would be playing around, and we would give them snacks, and sometimes we would rest, and they would play on the skateboards, and it was funny because one day we went to buy. It was one Sunday after church. My family stopped at the KFC in Zanin to buy some lunch. And this whole group of street kids were around the KFC at the time. And as we got out of the car, they recognized me. And so they ran towards me and they all, called me by my name. They said, Ernst, and they came towards me. And I said hello to them. And my parents were like very confused. And I remember my mom asking me, why do all the street kids know you by your name? And they thought it was funny. They weren't upset about that. But they were more upset about me sort of sneaking out of the house and in the night and going skateboarding at the taxi rank. But I the point is, I mean, your question was growing up and if I had black friends. So I really did, and I still do. But I think maybe a more philosophical point about that. I think this question that often comes up about white people and black people and whether they have friends from that are from a different racial group. I think it's an important question, but I think it's the wrong question if the underlying assumption is that we should eradicate our differences. We should pretend that everyone is the same. We should pretend that there are not cultural differences. I think the only real way to promote sustainable race relations is not to try to break down our cultures and to try and destroy the things that make us unique, but rather to recognize that and to build friendships on the basis that I don't pay lobola like the Zulus do when I get married, but they do, and it's a beautiful thing. And for them to be friends with me, or for me, they don't need to stop doing that. And for me to be friends with them, I don't need to start doing that. And this is a superficial example, but I think if that's the basis, this mutual recognition and respect, then I think friendships across racial groups, I think, is a very healthy thing.
Yeah, wow, really, really interesting. I also have a lot of friends from Sweden, from Finland. We go to saunas together. We several times in Ghana, trying to really see the world from our different lenses. So I really hear you in that, our differences are still really important to keep, although we can still be friends across races. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. I had just another really strange question anyway, but it's okay if it feels strange. But I
No, you
wanted
can
to
ask.
know I wanted to know if you have do you have any experience, any other experiences or moments that truly made you feel African at some point or any time beyond just living in Africa? I don't know if there.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do, but it doesn't. I've told the story to people, and it doesn't sound nearly as dramatic as the way it felt to me. It was really a life-changing moment for me, and there are many moments, but I'm thinking about one in particular. But if I tell you the story, it's going to sound like a very boring story, but it was life-changing in terms of the emotions that I experienced. So I know many Christians and some Christian churches have this saying or this belief that you have to be able to give the date on which you became a Christian. And now I grew up in a more conservative church, so I can't tell you what was the day on which I became a Christian. I just think I've always been a Christian.
Yeah.
And I've gone through some times where I had some doubts about my faith, and I've returned into having my faith, getting my faith back. But I do have a date on which I decided that I'm going to spend my life trying to promote trying to protect the Afrikaner people and the Afrikaner culture. I don't know the exact date. I know it must have been in the year 2002,
Wow.
in June or July. And so I grew up going to camps, these cultural camps, where during school holidays we would go into the bushveld, and we would camp there, and sometimes we would survive in the field, and we have to catch our own meat, and try to catch something to eat, and make it, make a fire and prepare it yourself, and it was a lot of fun, and we spent a lot of time in the bush, learning about the plants, learning about the animals. And what we would then do is, and this has become really an intrinsic part of Afrikaner culture, is this thing of sitting around the campfire. And of course, we're not the only ones that do that, but it's really part of our identity, to an extent that our friends in Europe maybe don't understand it, or don't experience it the way we do. That feeling of making a fire in the bush, and you can hear the animals, you can hear the jackals in the background, or an owl, or the lions roaring, or the hyenas. You can hear that far off in the distance, and you're just sitting in the quiet. You listen to the fire, and you have a conversation with your friends. And I remember having experiences like that. And then this one particular evening I'm thinking about was when we started singing Afrikaans folk songs. So in Afrikaans we call it FRK liedere. The FRK is a cultural organization that compiles books of Afrikaans songs, and there are many. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of cultural Afrikaans folk songs, not pop songs, but folk songs. And I know I probably know hundreds of them by heart. And I remember we were singing that one evening, and I was sitting with my friends, and we were all in school, in high school, and we were just singing these songs, and these folk Afrikaner folk songs. All of them are about how much we love the country, how much we love Africa, how much we love our people, and how much we want to make things better. Now, I know there's this stereotype of the Afrikaners, which doesn't fit what I've just described, but that's really how I grew up. And I remember that one evening we were singing, and we were with friends, and boys and girls, and it was high school, and I just looked up at the sparks going up into the air, and this beautiful night sky. It was far away from the city. It was on a farm, and there wasn't really any towns nearby. You had to drive hours to get there. And I got I really felt this emotion pouring through me.
Wow.
And I felt that what I'm experiencing right now, living in my culture and being here with my friends, is something that I want to do for the rest of my life.
Wow.
And I want to spend my life protecting this. And I remember that night my parents were nearby, so I walked towards them. It was like 12 o'clock, and I woke them up. And I said to my dad, I've just decided what I'm going to do with my life. And so I said to him that this is what I want to do. And he said he's proud of me. And he said to me, but I still don't really understand, what are you going to study? So how do you do this thing that you want to do? And I didn't know either. But so if the question is if I can remember a moment like that, there was certainly a moment like that for me. And there were many others, but this one in particular, for me, on a more emotional level, was something that really impacted me on a very significant way.
Wow, powerful, really powerful. And in fact, the next question I'll be asking follows that, because it might be a little bit more philosophical now. So, like how you speak about, how you love Africa, these folk songs, and this moment. I'm really interested to understand, I remember I have a story. This actually strikes me a lot. We were having a conference at some point in a city in Finland called Turku. And we were two Africans in that conference, and I actually didn't know the second African, but it was introduced that there's a Nigerian here and also there's a South African. And when I tried to hope at some point during lunch we would meet the South African, it was the first time I was meeting a white South African face to face. This was in 2014, thereabout, during the time I was having my master's degree. And so it felt a little bit awkward, but we were the two Africans in the room. And so ever since then, I've always wanted to really get into the mind and the head of a white South African, really see how they understand South Africa from their perspective. So now, for me, my question to you now is, I want to know, how do you explain your African identity to other whites when you speak, especially outside of Africa? Is there a kind of contradiction you feel sometimes? Does it sometimes feel awkward? How probably you might have what probably today has been categorized as being you're white, but then speaking to another white, say a Swede or a Finn or a Dutch, but then you still maintain a form of Africanness. Do you feel any kind of, this is a little bit philosophical, but I know
No,
you're
no.
so philosophical in that sense. Does it feel like a contradiction somehow sometimes?
It could feel like a contradiction if you do not understand that identity is a nuanced and a layered thing. So a friend of mine, Ernst van Zyl, who goes by the name Conscious Caracal, had a great saying about
Yes,
this.
I know that channel. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. He said I interviewed him recently on my YouTube channel
Okay.
about this exact question, and he
Oh,
said
wow.
to say to someone, and I'm quoting him, to say to someone that you cannot be of Western descent, you cannot be Western and African, is like saying you cannot be green, you have to be blue or yellow, you can't be both. Because the fact of the matter is that it's a blend, it's a mix. And so the word, that's what I mentioned earlier, the word Western can be misleading because it might create the impression that Europe is our home when it really isn't. And the word African could be misleading because when people talk about African civilization, I don't necessarily think that includes the Afrikaners. I think we descend from Western civilization, but we are African. If by African you mean that this is our home, this is our place, this is where we became a people. And so I've heard people say to me that we are African, end of story. We're not Westerners, we are African. And I've heard people object to that, saying, no, we are Westerners, we are not African. And I think it's because both of those terms could have different meanings. But the fact is if the Afrikaner people are not indigenous to Africa, the question then is, to which continent are we indigenous? Because we're not indigenous to Europe. We're not the same as our European ancestors. And I know I have many friends in the Netherlands. I have some friends in Germany and in France, which is where we predominantly came from.
Okay.
And there are some important cultural differences, personality-wise, the way we engage with each other, our friendships, the way we conduct meetings, the way we just do these what people call microcultural activities, like just the day-to-day things. We have a different way, a different mindset. And so I often say to people that there are some things that the Afrikaner people, not some things, a lot of things, have in common, for example, with the Zulus, that we don't have in common with white English people or with the Dutch or the French or the Germans or Europeans in general. But then there are some things that we have in common with the English that we don't have in common with the Zulus. And I just mention them because the Zulus are a well-known example in South Africa. You could use the Sepedis or the Tswanas or whoever. But and so we really are unique in that sense. And we're a bit of a blend, this blend between being Western and being African. And in a certain sense, that could lead to the argument that actually we don't belong anywhere, that we don't belong in Africa because we are Western, and we don't belong in the West because we are African, and so we just left dangling. But I think the Afrikaner people, even though we would debate about this internally and to what extent are we Western or to what extent are we African, I think instinctively we understand this. And even though this is now a big story, Afrikaners leaving, going to the United States or to other countries, I am very much convinced that every single one of them, or almost every single one of these Afrikaners leaving South Africa, still have a very deeply rooted love for the African continent and for the African environment, the climate, the weather, the food, and the peoples that live in South Africa. And I think we are able to distinguish between the people and the politics, and the people are our home, and the people are part of our home, and this is where we come from, and I think this is very important for us to make sure that we do have a future on the African continent, because this is where our past is, and we hope that our future would be here as well.
Yeah, really. So it's really interesting. And speaking about the future, I mean, that you just landed well into my next question. Do you? I'm just interested anyway. Are there other parts of Africa you've visited, you've worked
Mm.
in, and what do you think about the current black leadership rising now in Africa in general? Because when you go on social media, you see the new AES Confederation in the Sahel region, the likes of Ibrahim Traore, really shaking off a lot of things in Africa in terms of leadership, taking back what belongs to, that kind of narrative. Is there a way the Afrikaners today are processing that is emerging in that region and also spiraling around Africa in that regard? I don't know. Have you probably ever thought about some
Yeah.
of?
So firstly, I've traveled quite a bit in Africa. Unfortunately, I've never been to West Africa, so I'll have to come and
Ah.
visit you. But I've been to. We once in 2017 we took a 3-week road trip up from Pretoria, from a house in Pretoria,
Mm.
and we drove 7,000 kilometers into Africa,
Wow.
going up through Botswana
Mm.
into Zambia, into Malawi,
Mm.
Zimbabwe. So we visited a bunch of, you could say, all of them were sub-Saharan countries.
Yeah.
But I've also spent some time in Kenya
Mm.
and in Tanzania. And I'd love to go and see the western part of Africa as well. And it was really fascinating to me visiting these countries and speaking with people, local people.
Mm.
I have to say, in Zimbabwe, I experienced that there was a big difference between people, just ordinary people you engage with on the streets of Bulawayo,
Mm.
as opposed to government representatives.
Yeah.
They were not the same.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
police in Zimbabwe are not the same as
Mhm.
the people you meet in the street. Um, and it to me was really eye opening, and I can't remember. And I have to say this, and it's really sad for me to say that once I crossed the Limpopo River to the north of South Africa, I immediately felt safer. I felt very safe throughout that trip in Zambia, in Malawi, and we slept among the locals and so forth. And at no point did I feel that I was in danger or anything like that. And then when I came back into South Africa, I started feeling maybe I should just check behind me and stuff like that again, because the experience of crime is just more real.
Yeah.
We do follow somewhat what is happening in Africa with other African countries. And recently there was this public spat between Cyril Ramaphosa and Paul Kagame of
Yeah.
Rwanda,
Hmm.
and it was more entertaining than anything else. I have to say I am a bit cautious to express too much of an opinion about African leaders in other African countries, whether it be Ian Kama or Kagame or these, but
Yeah.
because I know South Africa is a good example, but I feel like I don't know enough about these countries to have a strong conclusion about the development that it is taking. But in as far as Africa is rediscovering itself, it's a good thing. And in as far as Africa is working to chip away a future for itself that is not one that is shaped by its colonial past, but by its own identity. I think that's a good thing. And I've spent some time reading the works of some African philosophers, people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I
Hmm.
think he passed away
Yeah.
recently.
4 days ago. Mm.
Yes, yes, yes.
Mm.
Ali Masrai. I have his book on my shelf here.
Wow. Wow.
Uh, and I think that's fascinating to read, and it's and also in South Africa there's people like Credo Mutwa who wrote Indaba My
Yeah.
Children,
Hmm.
and I think what strikes me about that reading African, you could say Black African philosophy,
Mm.
is in a sense it's not too different from Afrikaner philosophy, that there's this trying to come to terms with a complicated past.
Mm.
And I think one thing that really resonated with me is what people like Ali Masrui wrote about how the African continent needs to find itself, and have to, the importance of language, and you could say liberating yourself by finding a sense of pride in your own identity and your own culture and your own language, and speaking your language, and being taking pride in your language and publishing in your language if you're an academic, and so forth. And these things, that it resonates deeply with Afrikaner culture as well. Is this idea of taking pride in who you are. We had this very unfortunate history with the British, who really denigrated us during the Anglo-Boer War. They had this big propaganda campaign about how the Afrikaners are lesser human beings, and we are these dirty people just living in the bush, and so we've had some experience with that, and the way through was to take pride in who we are, and I think I can see that there's some of that happening in Africa, and to the extent that is happening, I think it's a great thing.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's. I think we'll be speaking a little bit about the shared British colonialism we shared. I think later. I think I have a question for you on that. But it's really interesting to when I started reading about what probably we might have similarly, especially Anglophone Africa. So most of the countries that were colonized by the British, and knowing fully well that the Africans also had a stint with that kind of part of history. I think that's really interesting. But I'm really intrigued about this what you just analyzed for me about crossing across the Limpopo and feeling a little bit safer and than coming. So my question now is in terms of the whole thing. People speak a lot about privilege, being white. As long as you're white, many doors seem to be open more than being black. This is now coming from a West African in our analysis. Many times I used to teach in a university also in Finland at some point, some few classes. And in fact, there were arguments that across the world, many people had to strive towards whiteness. Whiteness was kind of a force because the strive towards whiteness seems to be a strive towards privilege. So in that regard, when you say that you might have felt safer, maybe out of South Africa and all that, what do you think? Do you feel a certain way, a certain kind of privilege that comes with you being you today, maybe a white South African,
Yep.
as you move across the southern part of Africa, and how, if you have any stories to share or not, I would really be interested to just know about.
So yes, I've been thinking about this today, and the day before, because this theme of privilege. It's really unfortunate that the word privilege has become somewhat of a weapon. And the response to the weaponization of the word privilege is that no one wants to acknowledge if they have privilege. Because if you acknowledge that you have privilege, some form of privilege, then that is used against you. Then the next point is, okay, now you have to pay reparations, or you are guilty of something and you should be punished. And I've said this recently during another interview. I think, and I increasingly think, that one of the most important concepts in life is the concept of gratitude. And I am an incredibly grateful person. I honestly am. Because I grew up in a house with two parents who loved each other, who still do, who are still married. And we have these dynamics, and it's often talked about, parental absenteeism, and it's a problem in black communities, but it's also a problem in white communities. And I have many friends and colleagues and so forth who grew up in families where their parents got divorced, or there was violence in the household growing up, and things like that. And it happens in white communities as well. There's this stereotype about it. That's what it's like growing up as a black child. But I didn't experience that. And so in that sense, I believe that I'm immensely privileged. And I'm immensely privileged in the sense that I grew up in a family where we spent our evenings at the dinner table talking about, I wouldn't say philosophy, but talking about sort of bigger ideas. We didn't talk about money or things like that. We weren't exceptionally wealthy,
Okay.
but we were wealthy enough. But we spoke about things like events that happened in the past and how do we make sense of this, and what does it mean to be a patriot? What's the meaning of this word,
Yes.
and is it a good or a bad thing to be a nationalist? And I grew up having these kinds of conversations within the context of my family,
Mm.
and I realized only really after school that I was exceptionally privileged in that regard, not as a white person, but as someone having grown up within that family context.
Yes.
And it gave me an incredible advantage
Mm.
after school at university. Firstly, in terms of my knowledge of history,
Mm.
not because I'm some history guru, but
Mm.
I grew up, it was just natural in the context in which I grew up. We spoke about history all the time. So I read history books in high school because I thought that's normal for people to do. And so in that sense, I'm incredibly privileged. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about just how privileged I am and how grateful I am for these things.
Mm.
But the problem with the narrative today is, like I said, you cannot admit to having privilege,
Mm.
because if you admit to having privilege, then that's used against you as some form of a weapon.
Yeah.
And I saw that it's a bit, maybe a superficial example, but in the
Mm.
Netherlands recently, the prime minister or the former prime minister apologized for slavery,
Mhm.
the Dutch history of slavery.
Yeah,
And they,
I saw that I think I saw that stint. It was
yeah,
in public, right? I
yeah,
think.
yeah, it was like a year or two
Oh
ago.
yeah, yes, exactly.
Yes.
Mm.
And so people thought that was a great thing, but then the immediate next thing that happened was people said, okay, now you have to prove that you are really sorry.
Mm.
Now you have to pay reparations. Now you have to give money to
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
so this whole theme of privilege has become, so I would say, contaminated by people who are trying to weaponize it. And
Mm.
it's the case. I think it's wrong. I think it's you could certainly say that some communities have more privilege than other. That's certainly true. But I think it's wrong to generalize to such an extent to say white privilege is the following. And I would say, you could say in the South African context today, black privilege is the following. Because
Mm-hmm.
there are some things you can say and do if you are black in South Africa that you cannot say or do if you are white. But even that is I think too simplified, because I think the privilege that you get within the context of your family
Mm.
outweighs any privilege that you can have as a result of other factors. That's my personal experience and my personal belief.
Mm. Yeah, super, super. Thanks so much. Yeah, so really interesting. Now this is kind of like a little bit more futuristic. I remember I have a master's degree in future studies, so many times I try to
Oh,
really
great.
the year ahead. I want to know what if maybe among the Afrikaners, if you have had this discussion or even you personally reflecting on this, is there any kind of hope on how Afrikaners view that they would be seen by Africans probably in the next 50 years? Because there are some really interesting stats I've been coming across. We know that the median age on the continent is 19. We know that by 2050, Africa would be, it's argued that 1 in 4 people will be living in Africa. By 2050, it's argued that I think 25% of the world's workforce would be provided by people who identify as Africans. So I don't know, do you think there's any kind of way in many Afrikaners today hope that they would be seen by Africans maybe in the next 40, 50 years? And maybe this might not only be the Afrikaners in South Africa, but if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken, there are many Afrikaners who live abroad also, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Probably a million.
a million, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Good. So, do you think, have you reflected on that question a little bit at some
Yes.
point? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so it ties slightly, it links back to the question you asked about if
Mm.
what could we if there was one thing that we would
Yeah.
like people of Africa to know or understand about us. I think the answer to this question is that we really do want to stay in Africa,
Mm.
and we really are, that contrary to the stereotypes,
mm,
we really are committed to cooperation. And obviously not everyone. You will find, Afrikaners who are really racist.
mm,
But they are really the idea of being racism is not a popular thing among Afrikaners. And if people are racist, it's very frowned upon, and it's very it's people on the outskirts, marginalized, people who are like that.
mm,
But I think, and this, I'm going into dangerous territory here,
mm.
but there still is an element of, I'm trying to find a better word than
Yeah,
prejudice. But,
ready,
but
yeah.
let me explain what I'm trying to say, and then maybe I'll get to the better word.
Yes.
That people within the context of their communities develop certain ways of doing things and certain ways of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not to say that that way of thinking is right and other ways of thinking is wrong. It's just that that's the way you do things. And sometimes there's some historical reason why people do things in a particular way, and have celebrate things in a particular way and conduct themselves in a particular way. Sometimes it's inexplicable.
Mm,
But what really concerns me and have been concerning me about this idea of the new South Africa,
mm,
I think the philosophy on which this idea of the new South Africa was built
mm,
was deeply flawed,
mm,
because the philosophy said that even though South Africa is very big,
mm.
and it's so, just like in a European context,
Yeah.
from the north to the south of South Africa is the distance from Rome to London,
Mm.
and from the
Wow.
east to the west is the distance between Madrid and Copenhagen.
Wow.
So it's South Africa is very big, and so the philosophy was, for within this big territory, the context of this big territory, and within the context of this very diverse territory with all these different nations and communities and languages and so forth, the way to move forward is for us to put our, what I call, natural identities, in other words, our cultural identities and so forth, to put this sort of on the back seat
Mm.
and to adopt a new identity,
Mm.
which I call an artificial identity. And
Yeah.
that's the identity of being a South African.
Mm.
And so a lot of people take pride in being a South African. You would see that all the time. But if being a South African implies you cannot be an Afrikaner anymore, you cannot celebrate your cultural, your cultural heritage,
Mm.
then that immediately puts you at odds. The political project puts you at odds with the very core of who you are,
Mm.
and then people retaliate.
Mm.
And I think this idea of having to give up who you are in order to build bridges to other communities
Mm.
has been tried in South Africa, and it has failed. And I really think the way to build bridges is not to say, let's all pretend that there are no differences. Let's all pretend that, let's all speak English as if we haven't grown up with different mother tongues. And, let's all just pretend that we are individuals and that we don't have cultures.
Mhm.
That it doesn't work because it's not natural. And
Mm.
so the natural way is to recognize that there are things that, we think in a particular way. We have differences when it comes to philosophy. We have different perspectives of history.
Mm.
And different perspectives doesn't necessarily mean that the one is right and the one is wrong. It's just different experiences from the same historical events
Yeah.
leading to different conclusions.
Mhm.
And rather than trying to abolish that, to celebrate that. And I think if that's the basis for moving forward, I'm really optimistic
Mm.
about race relations. But that's built on the idea that we recognize cultural dynamics,
Mhm.
as opposed to regarding cultural dynamics as something that has to be destroyed in order to create some form of a better future that never arrives.
Yes, wow, really powerful. And I really hear you correctly in that because, for me, I'm also, I don't like to use the word ethnically, but anyway, I'm Igbo naturally. And
Mm-hmm.
in Nigeria, we have also really like different ethnicities as it is also in South Africa. And, one of the bases of culture in Nigeria is that as much as we embrace our Nigerianness, we also really fight to ensure that, like my Igbo-ness, for example, is still secure in language, in the food we eat, and it's a core of our being Igbos, and and all. So I really hear you correctly, and thanks so much for that response. And now I think we'll be going a little bit deeper. First of all, I just want to, I think I stumbled on a video. Oh, I don't remember his name now. Maybe at some point I will. But it was an interview between this, what we would naturally still call a white South African, and Mac G. I think this was an interview on Mac G's channel. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you know Mac G. He's a podcaster in South Africa, really big
Mm-hmm.
podcaster. And he spoke about the apartheid era, you know, the kind of things they spoke about in their home, and that he was shocked about the apartheid machinery, that somehow there might have been some white South Africans who didn't know what was really going on outside, but then
Mm-hmm.
within their homes they had a different discussion, as regards what the whole apartheid machine was all about. So I don't know. I remember now you said that you were four during this time when the apartheid regime ended, and I really saw that in your documentary Tainted Heroes. I watched that documentary, like I've mentioned in a previous video on the train, that was a really powerful documentary. So you say that you were four as at the time apartheid ended. But do you recall somehow what kind of discussions or conversations you heard about apartheid in your home growing up during this time, considering also that you say your dad was like a soldier in
Mm.
the are you able to remember or reflect on some of those discussions?
I can't remember much
Mm.
of. I can remember some, but not much of the conversations at the time. But I can tell you about what I've learned afterwards in
Yes,
speaking with my
exactly.
parents and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So what I can remember at the time was that there was a deep concern among Afrikaners about what would happen once apartheid ends. You know, there was a fear.
Yeah.
And I remember people were concerned about that. And like I said, my father was in the military. He was more an officer. He wasn't a soldier.
Okay.
He
Okay.
worked at military intelligence.
Oh wow.
And then he resigned eventually. I remember there was this concern: what is going to happen? And I remember people, my parents and
Yeah.
other, let's say white Afrikaner
Yes.
parents of my friends,
Mm.
uh, very, I almost want to say frantically watching the news at
Mm.
night,
Mm.
and what's happening in the country and what's going to happen, and trying to prepare for this very uncertain future.
Yeah. Okay, so this was between 90 and 94, right?
No. This was before
Oh,
1990.
before. Okay.
Yeah, let's say now around 88 to
88.
92,
Okay.
around that time.
Yes,
Around
yes,
that
yes.
time, yeah.
Good, good, good. Yes.
Um, and I remember, I don't know what year that was. Was it 1992?
Mm.
The incident, the very famous Bophuthatswana incident,
Mm.
where members of the AWB, this small but right-wing group in South Africa, drove into Bophuthatswana, which was one of the homelands,
Mm.
and they wanted to start some form of an armed insurrection,
Mm.
and some of their members were shot dead by the Bophuthatswana police in
Wow.
front of the TV cameras. And so that night,
Wow.
that was broadcast, and what that had a massive impact on the psyche of the Afrikaners, and I think black South Africans,
Yeah.
because a lot of people were very afraid of the AWB. It was this small semi-militaristic group. They made these very powerful strongman speeches
Yeah.
about, and it was very right-wing, and people were very scared of them. And
Wow.
then to see members of this movement being shot dead
Mm.
in front of TV cameras
Mm.
really changed the way people thought about that movement. And I think it created a lot of fears among Afrikaners, even though they weren't supporters of the AWB.
Yeah.
But I think it showed to black South Africans that this organization is not as powerful as people think they are. I think that's how it was interpreted.
Mm.
What I can also remember is one morning, I think was it 1992 or 93? I think 92.
Mm.
Driving in Zanin after we've moved in town, and there were these, the posters on the street poles, the lampposts about what happened in the news, and all the posters said Chris Hani murdered. And I remember that vividly, and everyone was talking about Chris Hani.
Yeah.
And I didn't know who Chris Hani was. I just heard that he had been murdered,
Wow.
and something bad is going to happen. And I remember asking my dad, who is Chris Hani? And he said to me, he's the leader of the Communist Party. And I said, what's a communist? And
Wow.
well, I was like, I don't know, 5 or something, or 7, I don't
Wow.
know.
Yeah.
And I remember that he said something, but I didn't understand what he was saying.
Mm,
So I remember these things. I remember there was a concern.
mm,
It was some form of a fear. And I
mm,
remember there was lots of talk about the military because there was
mm,
this fear that there might be a civil war.
mm,
What I've learned afterwards is that my father, like I said, he was in military intelligence. But he was fairly junior. He was young. He was in his 20s.
mm.
And he wrote a memorandum to his superiors in the 80s saying that the apartheid system has, it's there's going to be some form of a collapse if there's not proactive
Yeah.
intervention.
Mm,
And so he made some form of an argument for um, talks to happen.
mm.
And he was arguing something along the lines of that the apartheid government or the National Party government cannot just try to hold on as long as they could, because if the longer they do that, the worse the outcome would be. And he told me later that he was then told in response to that he's way too young and too junior to be making recommendations about ending the apartheid system and things like that.
Wow.
So maybe if he was more senior, he would
Yeah.
have would have played a bigger role. But what I can say about my personal family is
Mm,
they were never really very political,
mhm,
like in terms of political parties. They were very cultural.
mm,
So we spoke, like I mentioned earlier, about history and culture and so forth. And the political thing was like this big elephant in the room that
mm.
was more annoying than it was something that got people excited.
Yeah, yeah, wow, so powerful, so powerful. And I think what the question is really important, especially for me, because I'm sure that there are many South Africans like you who might even have been younger, but really overwhelmed when they hear. I think one comment that really stuck with me on this channel was, I think it was a young lady who actually said that, she's trying to understand her country by being on my channel. And for me, as a Nigerian,
Wow.
trying to really understand South
Yeah.
Africa, I was mind blown. Like, so it's
That's
really,
beautiful.
yeah, I mean, like it's really important, this kind of narrative that you're telling, because I'm sure there are probably many younger and even much more younger South Africans who would identify today as white Afrikaners, so confused about all of this, and then most of the political rhetoric that sort of like heaps a lot of blame,
Mm.
so to speak, on the white South Africans. I can really feel that overwhelm in
Mm.
that regard. And so it kind of like takes me into my next question now, regarding, this is me now, West African and Nigerian, really, really getting a little bit more education on South African history from you. I just really want to understand your daily life in South Africa. You've spoken about how you sometimes feel safer being outside South Africa in a way, and being in South Africa, you have to always check who's behind you and who's following and all that.
Mm.
Do you think that there's a way you feel a certain kind of sense of responsibility or discomfort about South Africa's past? Do you feel are there any kind of memories or moments that stuck with you regarding the whole thing with the Africa with the past, when we speak about pursuing there's a way the EFF and the MK and these other left-wing parties have been studying, speak about reconciling with the injustices of the past? Do you
Mm.
think is there any way you usually deal with some kind of a sense of discomfort or responsibility? And what kind of stories do you
Mm.
think you can share around?
So, as a spokesperson
Mm.
for an organization, my instinct is to respond to a question like this with statistics. But
It's also allowed. I also love statistics, but yeah.
okay. Well, I might go to the statistics, but let me try to give you a
Okay.
more personal answer, given that
Yes.
that's the
Hmm.
question.
Yeah.
I recently was on a podcast of a friend of mine. We went to high school together.
Mm.
Galston Anthony
Mm.
is his name. He's got a podcast, and it's a black kid from school. He has a very interesting background,
Mm.
and he invited me onto his podcast, and we spoke for like, I don't know, an hour and a half about growing up and how do we make sense of what's happening in South Africa. And he asked me a question about the extent to which people could have collective guilt. And my honest response to that is people can have, I think so. I think people can have collective guilt. And this is me as a conservative, and people can have collective achievement. And I'll explain why I'm saying this. And I know some people who know me watching this might be shocked hearing me say this, but let me explain. I think this is me as a conservative speaking, and this is the reason why I'm not a liberal. And for me, the main difference between being a conservative and being a liberal is a conservative thinks about his identity as something within the context of a community. And a conservative thinks that or believes that his identity is shaped by his community, and his community is his identity in a certain sense. And the liberal view on identity is that we are individuals, first and foremost. And so the conservative view on family life is that if your parents were honorable people, that makes you an honorable person. Or at least that you are, maybe that's not the best way of framing it. If your parents have achieved great deeds, then you are respected because you grew up in that family. And if your parents have done some things horrible, then you have to prove yourself because you are in some way tainted by them. And so I think the example in that podcast was, let's say you and I, for the sake of the argument, your father and my father had an altercation 20 years ago, and my father, or the one, punched the other one in the face. The question is, should that influence impact us? And I would, as a conservative, if my father was the one doing the wrongdoing, I think I should reach out to you in some way and try to amend that. I think, however, and I know this is a very politically loaded thing to say because of the South African history and because of the context in which we are, but I think the discourse on South Africa's past has become so weaponized that it's hardly possible for me to say something like this, because then it's like the example of slavery. So then the response would be, oh, if you mean it, give me money, or something like that. And I don't think that's the way to fix things that have happened in the past. I think, and this is very controversial, but if that's the context of the question, I think the South African history and the apartheid history and the history of the ANC is much more complex and nuanced than the one-dimensional narrative that we hear today. And when I say it's more nuanced, I'm not saying that the apartheid system was a good thing, because it wasn't. But we have unfortunately reached the point where you can make up anything about apartheid as long as it's bad, and people will not just believe you, they will agree with you, and they will celebrate you saying this, even if what you're saying is not true. And so I can mention some examples. I was in a television interview a few years ago, and it was actually a host of a well-known mainstream TV network in South Africa said that the apartheid system was a system of concentration camps and mass extermination. And I said, but that's not true. I mean, you can criticize, and you should criticize, the apartheid system. But the black population doubled during the first 2 decades of apartheid, and then it doubled again during the second 2 decades. So that's not mass extermination. And so we can and we should criticize it, but we should be factual. And now, me responding and saying, but what you're saying is just factually not true, the response to that was, oh, so what you are saying is apartheid was not that bad. So it's this one-way conversation. You can say anything about the history of South Africa that reflects negatively on white people, and you will be celebrated for saying that. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. And if you say anything to the contrary, if you say anything that comes across as defending white people, then the interpretation is, oh, okay, you are a racist and you have some agenda and so forth. But that's sort of the political side of the question. I think, just to get back to your answer or your original question, I think on a personal level and on a relationship level, I think it's good for people to reach out to one another and to help one another when they are in trouble and so forth. And there are many examples of businesses doing that, becoming involved with community upliftment projects and so forth. And I think it's a good thing where that happens.
Wow. Very, very powerful. It also reminds me about, I remember it takes me back to the end of the Biafra War. I don't know if you know about the Biafra.
No, just vaguely.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So Biafra War was a war, Igbos, like
Mm,
people from my ethnicity tried to also get independence, but there was a war and then they had to be reconciled. And so ever since then, there has been, attempts at reaching out and all of that. So I really hear you in that regard. Also, I'm also trying to really understand, because this whole thing about the lack of trust that I
mm,
can see. I see it a lot on my channel. In fact, because of the fact that most of my topics try to find a meeting point between the blacks and the whites, and so
mm,
far, I've not yet met an Indian and colored leader to do this kinds of interview. But that's the goal, objective of the channel. Many blacks usually come to my channel and really, really kind of like I learned this word from one guy called Sama Sambit. It's a coconut. I think it's a South African. I learned
Black on the outside and white on the inside. Yes.
Exactly, exactly. So
Mm,
that's actually a word that I've seen a lot on my comments. And whenever it is that you try to speak to a white South African like this, I think probably an outsider like me would be in the best position to have this kind of discussion with you
mm,
because I don't have that kind of like bias of a historical
mm,
baggage to continuously think about. But when you think about this lack of trust that Black South Africans have gathered towards AfriForum and
mm.
Solidarity. What do you make about it? What kind of reflections do you have about that trust deficit? And are you concerned about it in the future?
Yes, so South Africa is most definitely a low trust society.
Mm,
I think part of the reason is because there are such differences among the communities living within South Africa when thinking about philosophy,
mm,
whether consciously or subconsciously, when thinking about history and when thinking about culture. And while these differences exist, there is just this immense pressure on us to pretend that there aren't differences,
mm,
to pretend that we are all the same and that we are all just South Africans,
mm,
by implication that there are no differences. And so people um, on either sides of the spectrum go into some form of a backlash against that idea because they can see that there are differences between people. And
mm,
often these differences are not good, and it's not good and bad, it's just people think differently. Like the Zulu nation believes, and many others believe in the idea of communal ownership of property, but that's very, you could say, alien to a Westerner. Like we believe in private property rights, and if you don't have private property rights, how can you build an economy?
mhm,
But many people in South Africa don't think that way. They see private property rights as a route towards exploitation and so forth.
mm,
I do think um, people have become victims. I'm not saying black South Africans. I think everyone living in South Africa
mhm,
have become victims of political ideologies that oversimplify particular events and particular narratives,
mm,
and that present what's happening into a dichotomy of perpetrators and victims.
mhm.
And unfortunately, the mainstream narrative in South Africa is that white people, by definition, are perpetrators and black people, by definition, are victims.
Victims, yes.
But you also get that narrative the other way around, that black people, by definition, are perpetrators and white people, by definition, are victims.
Mm,
And I don't think that's a healthy. It's certainly not a healthy way of approaching politics and societal issues.
mhm,
There is a trust deficit, and I think that is exacerbated by politicians who respond to every issue
mm.
by exploiting the dark sides of our human souls,
Yeah.
by framing every issue in the context of anger and hatred
Mm,
and themes like oppression and exploitation and so forth.
mm,
And the fact of the matter is that if you are poor, there could be a variety of reasons why you are poor. It
mm,
could be because someone stole from you. It could be because you have been exploited or oppressed. It could also be that you've made some bad decisions in life. It could be that your parents taught you wrong things. It could be that you don't work hard, and there could be a variety of reasons. And but the only reason that we are allowed in quotation marks to talk about in South Africa is exploitation. So if you are poor and black, and if you are poor, then it is because you are black. And if you are wealthy, it is because you are white. And black poverty is framed as, by definition, the result of white oppression. And white wealth is framed as, by definition, the result of exploitation. When there could be other factors. So there could be a variety of factors. It could be, I was listening to a psychologist recently talking about this same phenomenon. And the psychologist said that, broadly speaking, there could be three reasons for different outcomes. If there are different communities and the outcomes among these communities are not the same, broadly speaking, there could be many reasons, but you could categorize them under three headings. The one is conspiracy. The other is culture. And the other one is biology. And now biology is something no one wants to touch or wants to go to, but I think it's worth talking about culture, talking about the extent to which a healthy culture is necessary to grow out of difficult circumstances. And Thomas Sowell, the American economist, has done a lot of research on this, and he wrote a book. Well, he wrote many books about this topic, but his broad conclusion is that there has never been an example throughout world history where a community was lifted out of poverty as a result of political intervention. And think about that. Can you think of an example of a community that was very poor, and then there was some policy decision or some law enacted by parliament as a result of which they became wealthy and successful? There are literally no such examples. And so his conclusion is that the only way a community could grow from poverty to affluence is through a combination of three things. And those are his words. He says it is the combination of skills development, hard work, and savings, a culture of savings, not spending more than you earn. And these are difficult things to achieve, but we cannot really talk about these things in the South African context because we have been so bashed with this narrative that everything should be blamed on white people, that I think it would be really healthy to have a conversation about cultural dynamics. And I think let me just say this, because I've mentioned this in the past and people have misunderstood me as trying to suggest that black South Africans are lazy. I really don't think that. Black South Africans work really hard. You can see that in many terrains. Of course, you would find lazy people, but you would find lazy white people as well. And I can point to many such examples. But it's the hard work combined with skills development, in other words, proper education, fixing the education system, and then combined with a culture of savings as opposed to a culture of consumerism. And I think this is what and I'm not talking to black South Africans, I'm talking to white South Africans and Afrikaners as well. That's the way forward. That's the way to grow out of this. But in the absence of this, what we are left with is populist politicians trying to blame everything on race, and that leads to a low trust society, unfortunately.
Yeah. Wow, so powerful, so powerful. And I really hear you in terms of the low trust. It's really, most of the clashes I get in my comments on my channel really show this whole thing with the trust. And many times although people will argue it shouldn't be of my concern, but I get worried, because I don't really know it's difficult for me to see how that bridge can be. So it's one of the things I try to do on this channel, to see how we could facilitate this kind of discussions. Then in terms of this low trust issue now, I think we might be getting into one of the elephants in the room, which is land. In terms of land, it was only when I started studying the farm murders in South Africa. I'm yet to order your book. It's on the way. I think I was recommended by some people on my channel. that you wrote a book on this also with farm mothers, and so I ordered a copy. It's on the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. So, but one thing I wanted to highlight was that it was when I started studying about farm mothers in South Africa, I started understanding the same phenomenon we had in Nigeria, but really wasn't as grotesque, I think, and also covered by the global media as much as it has been in South Africa. Nigeria, we have a really unfortunate history where we had a coalition of different ethnicities into one. We had herders, people we would call cattle rearers, whose lifestyle, their worldviews are around, herding. All right. And then also, they move around grazing and getting into different parts of the country as well, trying to look for food for their cattle. And so this causes a lot of clashes, sometimes leads to what many have called a terrorist, where there are farm attacks in Nigeria, and people who own farms are unable to go to their farms. So this is maybe like a low key version of the perspective of farm mothers we came to learn about in South Africa. So I just really want to understand. I know there's been a history about the Natives Lands Act in 1913. I just made a video today about with a lady in Citizen Concern. She wrote about
Yes.
how South Africans need to get beyond the blaming game. And yes, the land thing is a question that we should recognize, but we should move forward. But from the perspective of the Afrikaner, also from your perspective, because I like to really hear your own personal. This is one way I think many South Africans are hungry to know you. I think later in the discussion, I will ask you a few questions. Many might see you as a racist and all of that, but I would like to, we'll get into all of that. But I want your own personal perspectives on what does land mean to you personally, and if possible, even to your family, as it were. What would you say land means to an Afrikaner? How would you say the quest to return the land, especially as I hear from the EFF and the MK parties, how is it articulated or understood by Afrikaners or white South Africans today?
So there is a reason why the Afrikaners are also known as the Boers, because the word Boer means farmer, and we became a nation through farming, and that's actually how our story starts in back in the Cape, when the Dutch had this refreshment station or settlement there for the ships passing around the African continent. And the people who lived there, the Dutch who lived there, were initially all employees of the Dutch East India Company. And there were some frictions among the employees, and eventually some of them were released from their contracts to become farmers. In other words, they were now living in South Africa, but they weren't employees of the Dutch East India Company anymore. And so that they could become farmers, and so that they could sort of start grow an economy. And in a certain sense, that's how we as a nation started, was through farming. And that has always been our go-to position. So there are many Afrikaans songs today, popular, like pop music songs about farms and about being a farmer. And it's something that is very much part of how we think about ourselves. So I don't own land. I have a house. I mean, I don't have a piece of land outside of Pretoria somewhere. And so if people say to me as an individual, give back the land, my response is, what land? But of course, I'm a member of a community. I think I should just say this about this thing of returning the land. I think many, again, contrary to popular belief, many Afrikaners would agree with the notion of returning the land. But there is a very important difference between restitution and redistribution. And restitution is this process that we've had of land claims being filed. Restitution is to say whose land was taken away by whom, and that land should be given back. And we have had such a process in South Africa, and more than 90% of those cases have been settled. Redistribution is just saying who owns this land, and if the person is white, then that's a problem. But even if you bought the land, it's still a problem. And so I've told this story before, but I was at a land summit a few years ago, and a spokesperson for the Department of Land Reform spoke about just how bad it is that white people own so much land in South Africa. And there's also some fabricated statistics. This claim that white people own 80% of the land is not true, or 70% of the land. It's something that people say all the time, but it's not true. And this person just spoke about taking land from white people and giving it to black people to correct historic injustices and so forth. And the evidence of the historic injustice lies in patterns of land ownership. And so I asked this person, can I give you a hypothetical scenario, and then you should explain to me what is the government's position on this to help me understand your view on the land issue. And so the hypothetical scenario is, here's a piece of land that is owned by a white person, and the government embarks on land reform or transformation and all of this. They take the land from the white farmer and they give it to a black farmer in the name of transformation, and in the name of, or a black person who then becomes a farmer, in the name of correcting historic injustices, in the name of justice and all of these things. And then, let's say 2 years down the line, this black person who now owns the land decides that actually he doesn't want to be a farmer. He would much rather have a house in the city and live there. And so he puts his farm in the market and he sells it. And the purchaser is white. And now the farm is owned by a white person again. And so I asked this government representative, what is the government's position on this? Is it a historic injustice or what? And the response was, in that case, the correction of the injustice has been reversed. So the fact that this white person owns the land, having bought it legally from a black person who sold it willingly because he doesn't want it, all of these things don't matter. The only thing that matters is that the owner of the land cannot be a white person. And that, if that's the policy, it's just fundamentally racist. That's all. But saying that, I'm not arguing that there were cases of land dispossession, that has to be corrected. I think, and this links up to the question of the farm murders, that the Afrikaner people especially see farming as part of their identity. I mean, myself, I grew up in an agricultural community. I've been living in the city now for, 2 decades, more than 2 decades. But I still, the Afrikaans word is plaasjapie. It means farm boy. So in Afrikaans, you say you're either a stadsjapie or a plaasjapie. You're a city boy or a farm boy. But I still introduce myself to people as a plaasjapie, as a farm boy. I still think of myself as someone living on a farm, even though I don't have a farm and I live in the city, and I have lived in the city for decades. And so this kill the boer, kill the farmer, we interpret that as an attack on us as a community based on our identity. And some people, and in my case, Julius Malema and Floyd Chivambu, have personally explained to me that when they say farmer, that is what they mean, or that is the interpretation thereof. And so people take this hate speech very seriously. They see the farm murders not just as...
Sorry, I didn't get that, Doctor. You said when Julius Malema and Floyd Chivambu say farmer, that's what they mean, or?
Yeah, they associate farmers with Afrikaner identity. I have heard them say, no, a farmer, like the chant Dubula Ibunu. So they would say Ibunu is the Zulu word for boer, not for farmer. The Zulu word for farmer is a different word. And so sometimes they would say there's a difference between being a boer and a farmer. But other times they have said this, and they have said this to me personally as well, that they see farmers and boers as the same thing. So depending on the audience, that determines how they explain it. That's my experience.
Wow.
But these chants about killing farmers, and then we have chants like, kill the boer, kill the farmer. The way we hear that is it's just two synonyms. It's not boers and farmers that are two different things. It's the same thing. And so we take this very seriously, and we see the farm murders as as an assault on us as a community, not just people on farms being killed. And that's why a lot of people look at the farm murders and say this is Afrikaner genocide that is being committed, because it's Afrikaners who are being targeted. If you attack the farmers, you attack the Afrikaners, and it's deeply connected in the psyche of the Afrikaner people, and I would say of many Black South Africans. It seems this idea of being a farmer and being an Afrikaner.
Yeah. Wow. So powerful. So powerful. So it probably explains the reaction in a way from probably the Afrikaner community when they hear these kinds of chant. Yeah. Wow. So interesting. Okay, so just also really interesting entrance into my next question. I was having a little bit of a back and forth argument with with a black who she would identify, I'm sure, as a black South African, and we were going back and forth on this whole thing about being angry about my take on farm murders and on it was actually in a debate I saw on DJ Boo's channel with Nota and Renaldo House. And
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
yes. And she was really angry about how it was that I was covering the farm murders in South Africa because it felt as though I was so passionate about it while the farm murders in Nigeria as well weren't really covered as much. And for me,
Oh,
most times I see there are many Nigerian podcasters already tackling Nigerian issues. I'm an academic. In fact, I think I might be one of the few channels by a non-South African studying South African minorities. And so this is what the originality of my channel. But she was really angry about my take and all of that. And some of her comments, I think, about when we now saw the fallout with Trump and Elon Musk, and people were beginning to think about what would be the implications about the Afrikaner refugee program and all of that. Her comments were, "Dream on, brother. You were so smitten about white genocide and Roets the other day until you saw a typical snake oil seller. I'm not sure why they hold so much appeal on to your overzealous ego. I was so for me that was the comment, and I really was taken aback because I really didn't know where this comment was coming from. Although I've seen a lot of comments like this by many Black South Africans towards me as a Black African trying to really understand South Africa. So, but anyway, I was taken aback by this term, snake oil seller. It struck to me about maybe some kind of deceptive term or something like that. So, my question to you now is, as a white South African living today in a democratic South Africa, I want to hear from you. What would you think might be some of the biggest misunderstandings that Black South Africans might have towards you, towards AfriForum, Solidarity, and maybe in general, the Afrikaners today in South Africa? Now, this is for Black South Africans. And what would you also wish they knew? Maybe it's that one thing at the back of your mind that you wish Black South Africans knew about Afrikaners today.
So let me just, for clarity's sake, say I used to work with AfriForum and Solidarity.
Yes, I know.
Yes, I'm still a member, but I'm not a representative. I'm not an employee anymore, so I can't
All right.
speak on their behalf.
Okay.
Although I have spoken on their behalf in the past when I was a spokesperson for them. So I don't want to try to answer this question on their behalf. I can answer it on my own behalf and on behalf of the organization that I represent.
Right.
But there's something that I've been thinking about a lot that I have thought, I wish people could just understand this. And maybe this is the answer to your question is, we are not, Twitter or X is a battleground, and it's not always the healthiest. It's probably the unhealthiest place in which you could spend your time, because someone once said to me, it's the virtual version of road rage. So it's very easy to scream at someone while you're in traffic because you're in a car, you're protected by your own car, and that person, even though the person is close to you, you have some protection. And then it's like that videos of the dogs barking at each other, and then the gates open and then they stop. And that's like social media just amplifies the dark sides of who we are, and it's probably true for me as well. I tend to play that game on X as well, and poke the monster and so forth, and say things that are deliberately controversial. And it's not necessarily always healthy. So you have to take it with a large pinch of salt. But what concerns me is the narrative that I see on X, that white people and Afrikaners in particular, and me personally, are just oppressors, that we have this deeply rooted urge to oppress black people, to exploit them, to return to the apartheid system, to embrace white superiority or white supremacy, and that that's just something that instinctively we like doing and we want to do. And we are angry now because we're not oppressing black people as we should be doing. And a lot of people say things like that, and that really is upsetting, because obviously it's false. But the thing I want to say in response to that is, virtually, and I'm trying to think if there are some exceptions, but every single battle that I've been involved with over the last few decades, with AfriForum, with Solidarity, and with Lex Libertas, the organization that I'm with now, on issues relating to the Afrikaner people, have always been defensive. It's always in response to a piece of legislation that seeks to target us as a community. It's in response to the government trying to take away our right to educate our children in our own language. It's in response to legislation aimed at preventing employers from promoting us in the workplace. It's in response to people implementing policy ideas that seek to destroy our culture or our language being taken away at universities and so forth. And so when you respond to these things by defending your place on this earth, you get attacked for trying to oppress other people. And so I would like for people who truly believe this. I think a lot of people just say this because they are just filled with, hatred and negativity. But if you truly believe this, then I would like for such people to show me the examples of things that I have done, or the organizations that I've been involved with have done, that is not about protecting our rights, but about attempting to oppress someone else. Because I'm not aware of any such examples. And if there are, then that was a mistake. And then we can talk about whether, what happened and so forth. So that's the one side of it. It's all these issues that we're involved with that is regarded as controversial. It's always defensive. And the other side of it is, what do we want to achieve? And I don't know if these people on social media truly believe that we have this deeply rooted urge to hurt black people or oppress black people. I don't know if they really believe this, but that's what they are saying. But the honest question, and a lot of people say, so what's your end game? The end game is not some secret. What do we want to achieve? It's not a secret. We're very open about that. We want our community to have a future in Africa. And when we say have a future, we mean we want a place where we can live out our culture, where we can be ourselves, where we can experience freedom. And that is not necessarily, building a massive wall around us and pretending that we live on some white continent. It's being who we are and cooperating with other communities and working together and reaching out and doing things together, but without the precondition that we have to dissolve as a people for that to happen. Because dissolving as a people is not an option for us. And we're willing to fight against this idea of dissolving. But I think there are people out there who seem to believe that in as far as we do not want to dissolve, that is somehow evidence that, we are driven by some negative contention. But that's simply not the case.
Wow, really powerful. And just a really quick chip question. Do you think, because I think you're a little bit more, in a way, you really like to visit many places, but would you be able to live in an Orania today in its present conception? Why and why not?
Well, so I don't live in Orania. I know people who live there, people who are very close to me, and I would live in a community like that, but I have chosen not to live there now because I believe that I need to do what I am doing in Pretoria.
Yeah.
or in, you could say, in South Africa.
Mm.
But Orania gets a lot of criticisms. Many of it is invalid.
Mm.
And what I really appreciate about Orania is that the spokespeople of Urania are probably the most honest spokespeople you would find.
Mm.
I've seen interviews where people point to speak with some Urania spokesperson and say, well, what about this? And then they would say no. And then the next thing the spokesperson would say, well, yes, that's a good point. Actually, we won't accept this. So
Mm.
they would answer, and I've heard them say this, they would go for honesty before trying to go for positioning. And so I'm not their spokesperson. I'm not sure if you have spoken with Joost Strydom on your channel.
I have not, but the reason why I asked was because one of the, I think is the African biggest YouTuber. His name is Wode Maya. He made a visit to Orania, and
Oh, yes.
yeah. So the video he had really got exploded on YouTube
Oh,
by the blacks, in the Americas and all of that. So I
yeah.
just thought that maybe we could just talk a little bit
Yeah.
about Orania. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the Warania idea, and again, I'm not their spokesperson, but the Warania idea is to build a community where Afrikaner culture is protected.
Mm.
And now people say, oh, it's a whites only town or it's a whites enclave.
Mm.
But this is something that Kali Kriel from AfriForum has pointed out, is if you go to Nkungumati, or if you go to Nkandla, or if you go to these black traditional communities in South Africa, no one says it's a blacks only enclave. No one says it's a, it's a black racial project. People say it's a cultural community. It's a Zulu cultural community, or a Ndebele cultural community, or Sepedi cultural community. But the moment when there's an Afrikaner cultural community, people say it's a racist project.
Mm.
And so there are some double standards applied there. And I think the idea is something worth supporting, even though I don't live there, because I don't think the time is right for me to live there. But I know many people who live there, and I'm good friends with people who live there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, quite interesting. I think probably I would get. I'm conducting a new research on Orania and this kind of cities, and maybe get used on this platform to also
Mm,
be
mm,
one fear around how many Africans are reflecting on Orania is this pursuit for an autonomy, just
mm,
like as the Biafrans in Nigeria attempted in 1967, and what resulted from that was a Biafra war. So I think that's
mm,
one of the prisms through which many black people reflect on Orania. But hopefully I would get used, and maybe we talk a little bit about some of those. But I have
mm,
just a few more questions for you. So yeah, I really have gotten a lot of education from you regarding South Africa. I'm just really concerned now because I remember you spoke about earlier how safe you feel
mm.
you maybe get across the Limpopo River, and how you have to check be at guard when you're in South Africa. Can you share a few stories, especially regarding my previous question on, this lack of trust people might have for people like you today, who, like you rightly explain, you defend when you feel there's an infringement on your community. Have you felt any kind of threats
Mm.
South Africa, attacks somehow within the context of the violence we see in South Africa? Do you feel, or have you felt somehow out of place because of this activist position you've adopted, activist you've become in South Africa? And if you can share some stories for us, I think it would be really nice.
Yes. Well, I have many stories. So you said that you ordered my book. You will see the preface to my book
Mm.
is called, the heading is "This is Personal."
Wow.
And I start the book by talking about people I know who have been attacked on farms, who have survived, and people I knew who have been murdered, friends and family members. So I grew up in a community where there were a lot of farm murders. I knew people who have been murdered on farms. I can tell many stories of that. Some of them, and also members of my family, especially extended family.
Mm.
So there's a member of my extended family on my in-laws, on my mother-in-law's side,
Mm.
who was shot in the head during a farm attack.
Wow.
He was literally shot right here, and the bullet went through his head and came out at the back, and he survived without any brain damage.
Whoa.
It's an absolute miracle.
A miracle.
Um, and a much worse story is a member. Actually, it's my father's cousin, a member of my, you could say, extended family, was attacked on a farm. She was a lady, an elderly lady. She was attacked on a farm. She was stoned, and then eventually she was killed when they pierced a garden fork through her head. That's how she was murdered. And then people growing up, the church I went to, there was an elderly lady in our church who was murdered one Sunday while her husband was in church. I know someone who was attacked on a farm and shot in Zanin, not the person. There was someone who testified to that effect in one of the Kill the Boer cases, but this is another person who was shot in the spine and he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. My own brother was attacked on a small holding near Krugersdorp, or Muldersdrift is the area. He survived, and there's a long story behind why. I think I think the reason why they didn't kill him was he was a hunter, and so he had these camouflage jackets in the house, and they had him tied up, and they had blankets put over his head. So he thought he was about to get executed because he was lying on the floor with his head face down, and he was covered with blankets.
Wow.
And he knew they were armed. And then someone came up to him and asked him, "Are you in the army?"
Wow.
And I think he said no, he wasn't in the army, but he had, as he was a hunter, he had camouflage jackets in the house, and he had boots and things like that. And I think they thought he was a soldier, and so they left him. There. But I mean, I've had personal stories also. Firstly, in terms of my activism, I don't walk around telling people about, I have death threats and so forth, but I do get that. I've had people threaten to kill me in very, very grotesque ways. And I get that quite a lot, actually. I'm not too concerned about that. So when someone says on X, I'm going to murder you in your house, it's alarming, but it's not the same thing as getting a phone call and someone saying that on the phone. And I've been in an armed robbery, a very bad one, actually, with my entire family. It was 3 years ago.
Wow.
It was my son's birthday. He was 10 years old, and we have these Spur restaurants. I don't know if you have them up in Nigeria. They are in some other countries.
Yeah, we do, yes.
And so we went, and this Spur has this tradition. If it's your birthday, they sing for you and they bring you ice cream. And so we went to the Spur for my son's birthday. It was he was 10 years old that day. And we had ice cream. We just had ice cream. I can't remember if we ate. I think we just went for ice cream without really planning it in advance. And as we got up to leave the restaurant, there was an armed robbery, but it was a bad one. People started shooting each other.
Wow.
And I had my son, so I have 4 boys. The eldest was 4, so was 10. So they were about 10, 8, 6, and the other one was, I think, how old would he have been? Maybe 2 years old, I think.
Wow.
And I was carrying the 2-year-old baby in my arms when I just saw people shooting each other like 3 meters in front of me.
Wow.
And I ducked below the table with him and my eldest son, whose birthday it was. And so I lay there with my baby and my son, my other baby, who's 10 years old. And we just saw someone fall down next to us, and he was dead, like in front of us. We saw this dead body with the blood. And I didn't know where my 2 other children were, because they were playing outside when we started getting up. I just knew we were in a restaurant, people are shooting, people are dead. I don't know where my 2 sons are. I have my baby in my hands, and my eldest son is next to me, but my other 2 boys are somewhere. I don't know where my wife is. She went to look for them. And so it was a really, really horrible experience. Eventually what happened was my wife was at another table when the shooting started. My 2 boys were outside. When they heard the shots, they didn't know what was happening. And so they went to someone outside the restaurant and they asked what was happening. So like I said, they were 8 years old and 6 years old, and they asked what's happening. And someone just said to them, they are shooting, fall flat, lie on the ground. But I think they were afraid because they weren't with their parents. They knew their mom and dad were inside and they were outside in the dark. And so they ran into the restaurant. And I remember them coming in, but I was too far away from them. So they came in, they were at the door, and I just heard my wife from another table, and she was screaming like top of her lungs. She was screaming at them just to fall down because people are shooting.
Wow.
And my wife was upstairs because this particular restaurant has, you can go up the stairs and there's a little play area upstairs. And she was upstairs and she looked down and she saw them coming in and she screamed at them and she said, just fall flat. And then I think they were rattled. And so one of them ran upstairs towards her and the other one ran towards me.
Wow.
And it was a horrible experience. And it turns out I called the police while I was under this table. The police didn't answer their phones. I called private
This was
security.
during Becky Selle, right? Could it be? Was this around Becky Selle?
It must be. It was. I think it was when he was the police commissioner. Yes.
Yes, yes. Wow.
Police didn't answer. I called several times. There was no response. And meanwhile, we're lying there, and we just saw this pile of blood, next to this dead body, next to my son, my children, and I. And I called private security and actually AfriForum Community Safety. They immediately responded, and they sent me a WhatsApp. They said, "We're now in our vehicles. We're on our way. We're 5 minutes away. We'll see you in a few minutes." So they immediately responded. And eventually, what happened was the shooting went outside of the restaurant. And what I didn't know at the time was the person who was killed was actually one of the robbers.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't make it any more frightening at the moment because it was really something. So I had to take my children eventually when we got up and left the restaurant. We literally had to walk over this dead body with the blood everywhere.
Wow.
And so it's really something. And this is and many people have such stories, and maybe this is a bit worse than many others, but I know people who have worse stories than that. So it just goes to this experience of South Africa being a violent country, and it's very sad to see what's happening in South Africa.
I mean, the first time I really came close to this was during a speech by Thabo Mbeki, where he spoke about how South Africa is an intensely violent society. And that was when I started getting on YouTube to start checking out. I really didn't have a clue. It's a really violent, feels like a really violent environment. I really
Yeah.
do. Many times I wonder if I've actually mentioned on my channel that maybe the African Union needs, I don't know if the police in South Africa needs help or I don't know, but I mean, I try to put it in the situation, the context of my country, Nigeria. Some of our police can really be very, very kind of like mean to this kind of criminals, but I don't know how it got escalated to the way it is in South Africa, but we'll keep
Well, part of the problem we have is with criminality within the police. So I wouldn't say the solution is to give the police help, because in many cases the police are part of the problem. Not always, but sometimes. So I would say the solution is just to give private security more freedom to operate, and community safety initiatives should be stronger. That's, like I said, the guys who I called, who immediately answered and immediately said we're on our way. People like that should have a bigger reach in South Africa.
Yeah. Wow, so powerful. Thanks so much. I really don't know if there's a still stamina to go. I think I have some more.
Yeah, we can do one or two more questions. I
one or
have
two,
a little
and
bit more time.
yes, one or two, and then we'll go. So I think just a little bit more of the whole thing with I would have loved to go through with this white Afrikaner refugees, but I think you did justice already on that. I'm really concerned about this thing with BEE. It's something I've been trying to really understand. On my channel, I spoke about how the mathematics of BEE in my Igbo mind doesn't seem to add up, because I can't, it's a struggle for me, but I can understand in the context of South Africa's history, the whole thing with historical injustice and all of that. But as an Igbo, the Igbos are really gifted business people in Nigeria. And to have them kind of like portion a part of their businesses to someone else, I think there will be struggle. So they would either leave the country and all of that, but that story for another day. But I want to get a little bit more technical. According to the time.com, the Thomas Piketty-backed World Inequality Lab has called South Africa the most unequal society in the world. They argue that the richest 10% of the population owns 85% of household wealth. They argue that although Black South Africans have outnumbered whites in the richest 10% of the population for 7 years, the wealth of the poorest in South Africa still has not increased. Do you have an explanation of this whole there's always this thing, I think it was among with a Namibian friend as well. He was also really angry in Namibia that a small portion of the people own a large portion of the wealth. Can you help us break this down on how this works in South Africa and how it came to be, and what do you think could be a solution around this whole
Yeah.
wealth inequality?
So I'm not sure about those exact numbers, but let's accept them for the sake of the argument. It certainly is true that there's massive inequality in South Africa. It certainly is true that white people on average are wealthier, even though there are black people in South Africa who are extremely wealthy, and there are many white people in South Africa who live in adverse poverty, who live in squatter camps. So that is also true. And it's certainly true that there is a massive problem in South Africa in terms of unemployment. I think part of the problem here is the ruling party in South Africa, the ANC, always talks about the poverty or the triangle of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. I think adding inequality makes it a bit more complicated because inequality is, in a certain sense, a fact of life. There are no societies on earth that are completely equal because people, by definition, have different talents, different skill sets, different proclivities, different interests, and so forth. And so someone who decides to become an engineer would most probably make more money than someone who decides to be a teacher. That doesn't mean that being an engineer is more important than being a teacher. And we shouldn't, and that's just how life is. And so, but there could be reasons, there could be external reasons that trigger higher levels of inequality. And the question is, can we address that? I think the thing for me is if the focus is on addressing unemployment and on addressing poverty, then by definition, you fix equality. You fix the inequality problem in as far as it is a problem. If you say we need to fix inequality without fixing poverty and unemployment, the easy way to do that is to just destroy wealth, and then everyone will be equally poor at the end of the day. Something like what happened in Cuba and the Soviet Union and so forth, and Zimbabwe. But what we have seen in South Africa is a transfer of wealth from many or a group of white people, not all white people, who are very wealthy, and there are still some of them. Many of them have left South Africa, to a new politically connected black elite. So this thing about talking about inequality in South Africa as a racial divide is very misleading and disingenuous. Yes, you can put a racial dynamic on it, but the actual problem in South Africa at the moment is people who are friends or family of the ruling party who are making tremendous amounts of money, often in dishonest ways, because of their political connections, because they get government deals and so forth. So that's one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is it's very difficult for a government to actually make things better with their policies and their laws. But it's easy for a government to make things worse by implementing destructive policies and laws. And unfortunately, that is what we have in South Africa. And we have these laws that, in a certain sense, incentivizes not working, because if you don't work, you get money from the government. If you start working, the government doesn't give you money anymore. And so we have 28 million people in South Africa. That's almost half the population getting social grants from the government. But it's basically scraps. It's not, you can't make a decent living from social grants, but it's something. And so we don't have an economical environment in South Africa that incentivizes starting a business. It's difficult to start a business. It's difficult because there's so much laws that you have to comply with, even if you are black, not just if you are white, especially if you are white, because of the race laws. but it's difficult to employ people because of all these laws and how you can employ people and minimum wage and what you should do and what not. And sometimes these laws have good intentions, but oftentimes the consequences of these laws, it is that the economy has become so difficult to navigate because of all these laws that makes it so difficult to do business, that you don't want to employ people, or you cannot employ people. You want to employ people, but you cannot because there's all these barriers put in place by legislation. And so I honestly think if the government would just scrap a whole bunch of these laws, that the economy would be better off and people in South Africa would be better off. And we can argue about the intention, and let's accept for the sake of the argument that the intentions are good. It would be a good experiment to see what would happen if we were just to put a moratorium on all these laws for, let's say, 2 years.
2 years.
We just take away all these laws for 2 years and see if the economy is better off or worse off. And especially we see if what happens to the unemployment numbers. Are black people more unemployed or less unemployed? And I'm absolutely convinced if many of these laws would go away, unemployment among white people and among black people in South Africa would decrease.
Yes, wow. Powerful, powerful. Thanks so much. Just quick fire questions before, because I would like you to speak about Lax Libertas, if I mentioned that correctly.
Yes.
Because I saw the launch on YouTube, and I tried to really, I didn't understand, exactly. So you help us understand a bit. But I just want two quick answers,
Sure.
2 fire questions, and then you tell us a little bit more about Lax Libertas, and then we wrap
Okay.
up. The Africana refugee program, in the wake of the Trump-Musk fallout, do you think that program is doomed? Do you think that fallout could affect that program? And what's your reflection on the future of that program?
So a few things. No, I don't think the fallout would have much of an impact on the refugee program. What I can say about the refugee program is it is an intensely bittersweet moment for us, because we feel as Afrikaners that we have some legitimate concerns, and no one wants to listen to these concerns. And now the President of the United States is talking about these concerns. And so that is a sweet moment. It's a good thing for us, even though a lot of people are angry about that. But it deeply, deeply saddens me to see Afrikaners adopting refugee status, and because the Afrikaans word for a refugee is a vlugteling. It's someone that flees. Wow. And there could be a very good reason why you leave the country. I'm not denying that. You could have experienced trauma. You could have been, excluded as a result of these race laws. There could be many reasons why you leave the country, and there could be valid reasons. But I'm to be completely honest with you, I'm deeply saddened by the whole refugee program. Wow. I'm saddened by the fact that it has gotten to this. Wow. And I'm saddened by the fact that for everyone that leaves, those of us who stay behind are a little bit weaker. And I'm also concerned that people are celebrating this refugee program as a way of getting to the ANC, when I don't think you are really getting to the ANC by celebrating people leaving the country. I think the way to get to them, if you want to get to them, is to apply pressure for political change to happen within South Africa.
Yeah.
But again, there could be good reasons why people are leaving. What I am concerned about is not so much, I don't think the Trump-Elon Musk fallout will have any impact on that. What I'm concerned about is what could happen if Donald Trump is not president anymore, if a Democrat becomes the president, because the practice has been in the US that when it's the other party that takes over, they reverse the policies of the previous one. So I think, and a lot of people have learned that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Yeah. So you go to another country and you find new problems. I am concerned that people who leave might be in a difficult situation, maybe in 4 or 8 years from now. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think that is a much bigger concern than the fallout between Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much. And I'm sure many might be listening to this, so I'm sure they will listen and maybe have a kind of like a plan towards that eventuality. Last question before Libertas.
Mm,
The parties are in the GNU, the ANC,
mm.
DA, PA. Do you see any promising party in your reflections across the whole GNU? And what is your overall perspective on the GNU and South Africa's future?
I am very disappointed in the GNU. I don't. I. It's very remarkable that the South African government and the ANC in particular have certainly taken a turn towards more radical policies recently. They have become much more aggressive in their policies, and all of this has happened, or most of it has happened under the GNU. It was under the GNU where they signed the Bella Bill, this bill or this piece of legislation that aims to take away the power of schools to decide their own language policies and admission policies. It was under the GNU where they signed the Expropriation Act. It was under the GNU when they started this blacks only empowerment fund where they just take more money from the taxpayers and they hand it out to blacks only businesses. So a lot of these radical changes have happened under the GNU, and that leaves the question, what are the opposition parties doing there? And I have to be honest. The question is, what's the point of trying to keep the EFF and MK out if you're going to implement their policy ideas in any case? And I think a lot of people have become disillusioned by the GNU. And I think it was a mistake by the DA, especially the official opposition, to present themselves as sort of the champions of the GNU, because people are losing faith in the GNU, which means people are losing faith in the DA as an opposition party. And I think if the DA as a party keeps presenting themselves as the party of the GNU, I don't see how it's going to work out well for them. But then the same goes for the smaller parties like the Freedom Front Plus and so forth. I think, politically speaking, if you're a political party in South Africa at the moment, it's better not to be in the GNU than to be in the GNU, because people are across the board are becoming fed up and disillusioned with the GNU.
Wow. Powerful, powerful. So in the context of this whole challenges with the GNU, is Lux Libertas supposed to propose a solution to
Yeah.
all of this or help us understand? Because I mentioned once on my channel that any kind of party that would want to salvage what's left to be salvaged from South Africa has to have the blacks, Indians, whites, coloreds, all the ethnicities as we call it, in that thing engaging actively. So what really is Lux Libertas about it?
So Lex Libertas the name is Latin. Lex means law and libertas means freedom. So you could say law and freedom. And the reason why it was one of the names that came through, we had a big process where we had public consultations and we had our contributors asking us, we asked them to send us name suggestions. And this was one of the few hundred names that we considered. And what we mean when we say Lex Libertas, when we add those two words together, is we say we are working towards a constitutional arrangement in South Africa that promotes freedom or ensures or facilitates higher levels of freedom. And when we say freedom, we don't simply mean individual freedom, because we say that freedom for the individual cannot be detached from freedom from the community for the community, and freedom for the community cannot be detached from freedom for the individual. Or put differently, the individual cannot be free if the community isn't free. And the community cannot be free if the individuals that form that community are not free. So you have to find some form of freedom for both. And in the South African context, South Africa is not just one big country with 60 million individuals. It's individuals that make up a variety of communities. And so what we say at Lex Libertas is, if we want to promote freedom in South Africa, we need to promote freedom for the communities living within South Africa. And our concern is that the political system in South Africa does not facilitate that. And if we want to promote freedom, we need to work towards a political system or a political dispensation that allows that. So we need a better, more sustainable political dispensation in South Africa. And the only way we believe we can achieve this is by having a political system that is much more decentralized, where the central government has much less power, where government is closer to the people, and where communal identity and cultural diversity is actually something that is protected and cherished, where communities can be themselves and can live out their cultures and on that basis cooperate, as opposed to the system that we have now that is fundamentally antagonistic towards cultural diversity.
Wow, that's so intelligently crafted. Thank you. I mean, like the many Nigerians have also been speaking a lot about the federalism and how to get the
Yes, yes,
center less powerful, because the real government is the local government, the one that people can
exactly.
feel, really. That's the basis for democracy. So I think that's a really well crafted ideology. Thanks so much, Doctor. This has been a 2 hour long discussion. And I'm sure most of my listeners really would appreciate everything you've actually helped us understand about South Africa. Do you have any final words? What would you say to probably my viewers watching this? My viewers are and strikingly, my viewers are mostly white South Africans. I don't know how that to be.
Yeah.
I really don't
Well,
know how that whole thing worked out, but yeah. But any
well,
parting words? Yeah.
now, let me firstly say thank you to you for the work that you are doing and that you have been doing, and thank you for speaking with me, and also for the way in which you framed your questions. This has been a very unique interview for me in the sense that, as I mentioned, I'm deliberately not trying to answer with facts and statistics, but to answer with personal experiences. And so I've shared a lot in this interview that I haven't shared before. And I'm actually grateful to you for giving me that platform. I think in terms of sort of a bigger picture, working towards a solution, I would really be grateful if people can come on board to the idea that what South Africa needs is to rethink the political system and to move towards more autonomy for local communities, more autonomy for cultural communities, so that people can have a much higher level of influence in governing themselves, deciding over their own affairs, as opposed to a government that is very much detached from the people deciding on their behalf. And this is something that we seek to promote, not because of all these things you see on social media, these dark intentions and whatever. It's because we, as the Afrikaner people, have been in Africa and South Africa in particular for hundreds of years. We want to stay here. We want to contribute, but we need the freedom to continue to exist as a community and not being attacked on the basis of who we are every day. We need the freedom to be a community in Africa, and on that basis, we would love to cooperate with other communities as well.
Thanks so much, Doctor. And Ernst Roets.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very
Really
much.
powerful.
I appreciate it.
Have an excellent day, and maybe we might have another meeting some other time.
Thank you. See you maybe in Nigeria one day or in South Africa.
Yes, in Lagos. I mean, like we'll walk. We were gonna get it cooking.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Have an excellent day. Yeah.
You too. Thank you.